Well, good morning, brothers and sisters. My name is Jason with the Ministry of Righteousness, and I am excited to be with you today. I have a word that has been stirring upon my heart about the righteous judgment of God. And I'm excited to share that with you today, as I've discovered that, man, there's just there seems to be a lot of confusion about God's righteous judgment and what that means for us as his children, and what that means for us through what Christ has accomplished on our behalf. And so I hope you guys are having an amazing day, and that you are just resting in the grace and the love and the sufficiency that Christ provides. And so I wanted to start off just with talking about, there's a passage that Jesus says where he says that there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and the one who fears has not been made perfect by God's love. We love because he first loved us. Maybe that's what John says. But I just want to encourage you guys today that there is no fear in love, but this perfect love that God gives is actually casting out fear through the revelation and the understanding of Christ's finished work. Not through our human effort, not through our ability to be able to perform, but perfect love is casting out fear as we are beholding the finished work of Christ. And I believe that this comes down to a foundational understanding of understanding God's righteous judgment for those who believe. See, in many religious systems, what we like to do is we like to pronounce judgment upon people based upon their performance, or we like to pronounce judgment upon people based on what we perceive that they should be doing, and then our perception to their obedience of what it is that they either are doing or not doing. Perhaps you've sat underneath that type of teaching before. Perhaps you felt maybe condemned, and felt maybe like what you're doing wasn't quite good enough. And I'm here to encourage you today that as we take a focus and a foundational shift from our performance and our dedication to God, and we shift that to the finished work of Christ and his sufficiency for all who believe, it changes the whole entire dynamic. Because instead of living our lives based on the judgment that we perceive about God, we actually start to learn that God's judgment is significantly different than what we might think. And so I don't know if you guys have ever been captivated through this place of fear, or had anybody talk or present a message that would leave you in this place of being like, well, gosh, I really need to get busy, and I really need to do this. Otherwise, God may judge me as unrighteous, or God may judge me as unholy, or God may judge me as, being a sinner or something like that. But the profound revelation of God's judgment is something that actually totally restores us and sets us free, because God's judgment is restorative in nature. Yes, let me say that again. God's judgment is restorative in nature. While human judgment is often to tear people down, to really make them feel like they didn't measure up to the measuring stick and that they didn't do good enough, God's judgment is restorative, in that his judgment upon you and his judgment upon me, his judgment upon us as his children, is righteous and holy and blameless and perfect. So on one side, people like to derive righteousness based on their perceived obedience to the law, or a law that it is that they made up, saying that if I, then maybe someday, what you could be someday if you is really the religion of the world. And so we like to measure and judge ourselves based on our perceived obedience to the law, or our perceived obedience to what we believe that God is requiring of us. I've seen this even carry over even into being obedient, where people will even say that we need to be obedient to God. We need to do everything that he says, and it all comes down to listening to every single word that it is that he says and being obedient. And then what ends up happening is we measure our obedience and we make a new law of our perceived obedience to God and all these different types of things. And I want to encourage you guys today that all of that mixture, and that mixture of the leaven of the Pharisees, which comes in and makes it a self-righteous based relationship with God, instead of based on the righteousness of God, which is given as a free gift for everyone who believes, it shifts things around, and before you know it, it puts the focus right back on you and what it is that you're doing and how it is that you're measuring and how you're performing. And I want to encourage you guys today that the law is not of faith. And the problem with the law is that the one who tries to live by the law that they believe that God's righteous requirement requires, or a law that it is that they made up, don't understand that the law requires perfection. It doesn't require a 99% effort of trying to be obedient. And that's where it creates this bit of a stumbling stone, if you will, in that the simplicity of Christ making us righteous by faith becomes a stumbling block to those who are trying to perform to earn God's righteousness as a work, or as their performance would deem. And they'd say, well, if I'm righteous, then all of my actions are always going to be righteous all of the time. Well, maybe not, because Abraham believed God and it was credited to him for righteousness. And you can see that because he believed God, he was called a friend of God, not because he did everything perfect. And we've got many examples of how Abraham did not perform perfectly. If you wanted to make a law out of, being honest, or if you wanted to make a law out of, being perfectly obedient to God, you can take a look at Ishmael and Isaac as a perfect example of, obviously Abraham not doing things perfectly, but being justified by faith and being a friend of God and the heir of the promise because he believed him. And so we're going to see that God's righteousness and human righteousness standard can be significantly opposite. The same way as God's required obedience versus, religious obedience is also very different. And so we're going to talk about those things today. So when we are looking at God's righteousness, it's important to remember that God's righteousness is derived from God giving us the life of his son, not derived from our perceived obedience to a work or to a human effort, but on God's dedication to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. See, the wages of sin is death, and the requirement of God's law isn't a pick our own adventure and to try to do good, and if our good outweighs our bad, it's not a Christian karma. The wages of sin is death. It's very serious. So when a person transgresses the law of God, the wages of sin is death, not a self-improvement program to try to get you back on the right track. And that's where it is that I believe that self-righteousness and the righteousness of God cross, is that God's righteousness is given to us as a gift by faith, where self-righteousness is a doing to become type of mentality, where we're trying to seek to improve ourselves to be right with God. One of them is not accepted by God. And I want to encourage you guys in that like the self-righteousness of us trying to make ourselves right with God through what it is that we're trying to do is a perfect example, or I would use an illustration of Cain and Abel, where it's like Cain got upset that his offering to God was not accepted and that Abel's was, to the point where he even persecuted and he murdered his brother because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. When you look at the root word in evil, when we're looking at a person who's practicing evil or practicing wickedness or practicing, things which are contrary to God, it's not what we might think, because I get it, in the religious system we like to be like, oh, okay, well, evil would just be evil would be a person who's going and committing adultery, or evil would be a person who's constantly drunk, and evil would be a person who uses foul language, or evil would be a person who is not being obedient to whatever it is that they perceive that religion is telling them to do. And while that sounds really noble, and it sounds like with undiscernment in there, we would say, well, yeah, all of those things are evil. And I would agree. Guess what? Sin is wicked. Sin is evil. But the root of sin is unbelief in the finished work of Christ. And what it is that God is offering to us is not a progressive work, but it is a finished work through the life of Christ. So when we're talking about evil in the Bible, and you go look this up for yourself, look at the story of Cain and Abel, and go to Blue Letter Bible, look at the concordance, and look at the word evil. the word evil is not a bunch of doing a bunch of stuff that is bad or perceived as sinful. Being evil is being full of labors and toils and being without rest, which is significantly different. So on one side, a person is made righteous and holy and is obedient with Christ because they're resting in his finished work. And on the other side, we have evil and wickedness, which is trying to produce what God gives as a free gift for everyone who believes. There's also an interesting, story that it is that Paul talks about. I don't know if it's a story, but he's talking about how the one who is born of the flesh persecuted him who is born of the Spirit, and so it is to this day. So the one who's born of the flesh, who's doing things through their own striving, who has to maintain this work, gets really, really upset and then persecutes the one who is born of the Spirit, who is trusting in the finished work of Christ. And so don't count it as odd when that happens, because that right there is just a reality that we're going to have to face. That the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. The message of the cross is offensive to those who want to do it through self-righteousness. The message of the cross is also offensive to those who have set up their own righteousness as the standard that has to be met. And unfortunately, it causes for them not to be able to enter into rest in the finished work of Christ because they're simply striving to do things in their own strength. Now, we as the body of Christ, we get this incredible privilege. We as believers have this incredible privilege not to strive and not to be in wicked unbelief and not to try to impose our self-righteousness standard upon other people or our perceived obedience upon other people, but we get this incredible privilege as the children of God to honor the righteousness of God by believing him. We get this incredible privilege as the children of God to be obedient by faith in the finished work of Christ, not by our perceived good works. Otherwise, we would start to boast about them, and then we would probably measure other people based on their performance, which is the root of this message as to what we don't want to do, because that is not of God. Paul tells us this interesting illustration where he says in 1 Corinthians, he says, it is because of Christ, it's because of him that it is that you're in Christ Jesus, who's become for us righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that if anyone wants to boast, if you want to boast, guess what we get to boast in? We get to boast in what Christ has done on our behalf. Not what we did for God, not how obedient we were to God, not how self-righteous we were to make ourselves right with God and our perceived obedience, but recognizing that, look, the wages of sin is death. The righteous requirement of the law required 100% obedience. Jesus fulfilled the law in perfect righteousness with 100% obedience. Jesus died in our place to take the penalty that was due to us. And because he was raised from the dead, and when he was raised from the dead, he gave us his life, well, all who believe are made righteous by faith in what Christ has done on their behalf. And that is the good news. That's the gospel. And that's what it is that we get to stand in and to be encouraged with. And I'll tell you that although that message is a bit contrary to religion, and it'll be a bit offensive to the self-righteous, that message right there for all who believe is the power of God. It's the righteousness of God. That is the wisdom of God for all who believe. And there's not going to be one person on planet Earth that's going to enter in through self-righteousness or through some other way. We get the privilege to be obedient to faith in the finished work of Christ and to honor his finished work on our behalf and honor his finished work for all who believe. So today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart as in rebellion. For God has promised us rest, and the one who believes enters into that rest because his works have been finished since the foundation of the world. And so God bless you guys. I hope that you have an amazing day. And remember that the gospel is not what you're doing for God. The gospel is what it is that he has done for us. And by our response to believing and our response in thanksgiving, what we're going to see is rivers of living water pouring forth from our belly as we rejoice in this. And don't underestimate it, because the grace of God will teach you all things. Don't underestimate this of being like, well, I've got to get more information. I've got to get more knowledge, rather than fixing your eyes upon the finished work of Jesus and having full confidence in what it is that he's done on your behalf. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about perfect righteousness, perfect obedience, perfect sanctification, perfect holiness, perfect forgiveness, perfect favor from God, perfect right standing, never out of fellowship, perfect union, sealed spirit to spirit with Christ, completely forgiven, past, present, and future. And I know that sounds like it could be a little dangerous because, man, if we say that you're completely forgiven, well, aren't you going to want to go sin? Aren't you going to want to go be disobedient? No, you're actually not going to want to be. When you're living from who it is that you were created to be, you're going to find that that's the fullness of life. That's your destiny. That's what you're designed for. You actually delight in being obedient to faith in the finished work of Christ. You delight in the righteousness of God. You delight in overflow with thanksgiving from this place of realizing what it is that he has done on your behalf. And so don't be tricked by pride and ego and self-righteousness because, man, I've been down that path and that is a stumbling stone. It'll cause delay. It'll cause confusion. It'll cause frustration. It'll cause irritation. And ultimately, we're going to come back to the finished work of Christ and be like, dang, I didn't realize that the gospel was that good and that I am because he says that I am. So remember, right? I am with you, right? There's no separation. The good news is that Christ is with you and Christ lives in you and he will never leave you or forsake you. So anyways, God bless you guys. I hope you have a wonderful day and we'll be back with you soon in Jesus' mighty name.